Hi everybody, this is video number 4 in my series about preparation and running of pen and paper role-playing games. And before we get into making our first adventure, what we need to take a few moments to do is to think about the actual world that this game is going to be taking place in. Now, a lot of people have different opinions about this, and the sort of consensus, I guess, among a lot of people is that you don't want to, as the game master or DM or whatever, you don't want to put more work into this than you have to right off the bat. But how much you have to varies a lot depending on who you talk to and what your goals are. For my own games, I'm the type of person that I like to put a great deal of effort into the setting, and before the first game takes place, I've likely come up with an entire continent worth of stuff with probably about 1,000 years worth of history, and several little towns and villages and cities and important NPCs and things like that. Now, while I think a lot of people would think that's excessive, it does work for me in the way that I tell my stories and run my games. So figure out what you need for your own purposes, but even if you don't go to the extent that I do, where you happily spend days working on maps and histories and things like that, I would at least try to, even if you never even write it down, in your head come up with sort of an imaginary outline of your world's geography. It doesn't have to be anything more detailed than, if you go west, there's a forest full of elves. If you go east far enough, there's a river with an empire on the other side. There's mountains in the south, and orcs live in the north. That's completely fine. But what you need to do when you think about this is also consider how much mobility the players are going to have, because if you're going to open the world up to the players and let them explore it, then you probably need to know what they're going to find, or it's going to come off as being really rushed and haphazard because, well, it is. And this depends a lot on what genre of game you're running and what setting your game is taking place in. So if you're running a dungeon crawl centric game where most of the time the players are going to be exploring underground ruins in one little area, then that's probably all you need to worry about, and the stuff I just said about the geography, that's only going to come into play as far as setting history and NPCs they're going to run into. So when they run into a NPC from a monastic order somewhere up in the north, then they'll have some idea of where that person comes from, but that's about all they need to know. But if you're going to do a world-spanning game where the players get to run all over the place and visit different kingdoms and cities and things like that, then I would definitely want to put at least a fair amount of effort into generating the map and the setting that these players are going to be exploring. Now, these are both assuming that you're running a traditional, like, fantasy role-playing game, like Dungeons & Dragons or one of its fantasy Heartbreaker games, but there are lots of other types of games out there too, so this is really going to have an impact on how much mobility the players have, because in a D&D type setting, it's pretty easy to stick the players underground somewhere and you don't have to worry about them. But if you're running, say, a modern game where the players have access to things like cars and trains and airplanes and boats and stuff, then you're going to have a lot harder time trying to constrain them, and they're going to want to naturally go places because that's something that's completely realistic for them to be able to expect to be able to do. But at the same time, the more mobility the players have in settings like this, like in modern settings, the geography becomes less and less important, because it's not so much a matter of where they're going necessarily, like geographic-wise, as it is just determining where they're going as far as the setting goes. So if they're in a particular city and they're going to go to a specific nightclub or warehouse or something like that, then yeah, I mean, it might help to know what part of the city that's in, or if it's by any cool landmarks or anything like that, but you don't necessarily need to know what street it's on and who lives across the street. And if you do decide to put that much detail in it, then it's probably going to be important, or at least noticeable. And I guess the other extreme of this is space opera settings, where the players have access to space travel and can go from one solar system to another with at least relative ease. These type of settings, I think, are some of the most important to restrain the players in as far as their movement goes, because there's no possible way that you can, with any degree of detail, come up with entire solar systems and complete with planets and civilizations and stuff like that just on the fly. So in settings like that, the way I've run it before is, and we'll talk more about this in future videos, but get an idea about where the players are going before they get there, so that way you can always stay one step ahead of them. And the players aren't thinking in terms of what you've already mapped out and what you haven't. They're thinking about what they want to do, so it's not really fair to expect them to just stay in the areas that you've prepared for them, unless you can come up with a pretty compelling reason for them to do so. So this is something you need to think about, and the amount of detail you put into your setting is going to really help the first adventure get on its feet. Because if you design a setting that contains a lot of conflicts, then it's easier for you to pull from those conflicts in order to generate a memorable adventure or two that makes sense within the confines of the setting and allows you to introduce some elements that you're going to pull from later on. And this has been James with the RPG channel, and I will see you next time.
Oh god, what would be a good